Mark and I have been talking about this concept for a while. I've gone to these meetings, I've gone to the conservative group a bunch, I've sort of sat back and been quiet, listening to everybody talk. And it's apparent that we have a problem understanding how government works. We talk about how we want it to work, we say things that we want to happen, but the masses out here have no clue how to make that happen other than just stand up and holler. Conservatives are worse than liberals in that we think things are supposed to be how we think they're supposed to be just because that's the way it's supposed to be. Liberals at least will go out and try to make some changes to get things the way they want it to be. What I'm going to go over here would be the exact same thing I would do if I was in front of the Democrat group today. They got the same problem to a certain degree. And, you know, it's like being a brain surgeon. You can't operate on a brain if you don't sort of know how the parts work. And so at the party level, local level, we've always relied on the state people to tell us what's going on. Well, both parties, there's no difference between the Democrats and Republicans when it comes to the bad operations they both do whenever they get into office down there. Let's just start with the Constitution. That's a good spot to start. That's the U.S. Constitution. Fairly small. You and I can read it. We can think we agree with it or understand it or whatever. Two people can read it, come up with a different opinion. We can scratch our heads how they got that deal, but that can happen. The only way that this ever is going to accomplish anything is if everybody sort of follows the thing. How they get around following this is what most people do not understand. This is Russia's constitution. A little bigger than ours, but if you read that, you'd agree with it. There's nothing in that constitution that I disagree with for the most part. It's just a good old basic document. They don't follow it. They follow it less than we follow ours, and that's why they're at. China has a constitution that's not bad, but again, they do not follow the thing. So it's figuring out how they get around that is always the question. How many of you think we're either a democracy or a constitutional republic?
Constitutional republic.
We're kind of a representative republic.
We haven't been either one of those since about 1780 or 1785.
Right.
If you get to looking at what George Washington said in his farewell address, it was very clear. If we ever start having political parties, we are doomed. There's nothing in that Constitution that authorizes a political party, much less a political party to have the power that we've delegated them to have. If you look at some of Thomas Jefferson's writings, it was always about we've got to be wary of when we get as crowded as Europe, because then we'll be as corrupt as Europe. And I think you can all see that. If you just look at the way they vote, the inner big cities are much harder to try to figure out what they're doing than some of our other areas are. Whenever I was in Austin, you had each representative and each senator had a little bit of authority. I mean, you were elected for your district, and pretty much everybody somewhat honored that for the most part. In the last 20 years, though, we have delved into an area where you're not really elected to represent your people, you're elected to represent a party. And so the hierarchy of either party ends up dictating how the rest of their members vote. If you don't, they come after you very hard next money cycle. Now, that's all become available because of the way money does. Back 20, 25 years ago, if you were to run for office, you either wrote yourself a big check or you begged around for some money. Nowadays, that ain't the way it works. They pick who they're going to have to run for the most part that they're going to fund. The top 2 or 3 people in charge of the money get out and raise the money for those folks so that they have enough money to do whatever they want to with. In the old days, 95% of your contributions came from within your district. They didn't come from outside the district. I had some that came outside the district. I didn't have anything that came from outside the state of Texas. Some of these elections now, both parties are dumping $1 zillion in here from California, from New York, from Florida. I mean, both sides are doing it. It's out-of-state money. These people, they don't give that money for the heck of it. They give that money as an investment. That's part of the reason you cannot get term limits. The powers that be do not want term limits because they often pay for these folks, and they want their investment to go on 10 or 15, 20 years. And so those are things that we've really got to look at. There was a book book written, Who Rules the Texas House? I would highly encourage you to get a copy of that and read that. The guy that did that's a guy named Ken Grusendorf. He was down there whenever I was down there. He was head of education committee, I think, back then. I'll talk about a little bit more of that in a little on another topic. But this is an excellent book to read. He goes through the changes with the rules in the Texas House over the years. The first rules were probably 10 or 12 pages. When Misty was here last week, I had her send me the current rules. These are the current rules for the Texas House. Mind-boggling.
And they got them at 4 o'clock the morning.
Yeah, mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that much bigger than the ones under the previous group, but it's just, that thing is growing and growing and growing. What these rules do is transfer the power from our elected official to the 1 or 2 or 3 that are going to run the place, namely the Speaker in the House. The Senate does a similar thing, and we transfer power to the Lieutenant Governor. In Texas, if you look at the pure Constitution, the Lieutenant Governor can turn the lights on when he comes in the morning, he can turn the lights off when he leaves at night. That's basically it. He's a presiding officer, but doesn't have any power. But one of the first things the Senate does every year, similar to what the House did, we create the rules of the Senate, which gives the Lieutenant Governor the vast powers that they've had over the years. The Senate has tended to always do that to counterbalance the power that the Speaker gets on the other side because of the way their rules are set up. So, but, you know, we represent, we've got 150 state representatives in the state, 32nd senators, but you really, in fact, only have about 3 senators and 2 or 3 in the House. Because if you're the Speaker and you're going to pick your people to be in charge of everything, we don't seem to ever look at any of that. We sit there and we see the end product of what happened, which we're not focusing on how you got there. The committee process, they use seniority for the most part as a way to get around common sense, I guess, because somebody's been there 10 or 15 years, and he's been over Health and Human Services, they're going to leave him over Health and Human Services. Whether he understands it or not, or whether he's off base or whatever, he's just sort of the one in charge of that. Lieutenant Governor in the Senate, and then there's Calendar's Committee in the House. When a bill comes up, you think your guy files a bill. If you don't file it the right way, the right timing, it's never gonna get anywhere. I mean, the system's set up for that. And so if a bill comes up that one of the top folks don't like, they can push it over to a rat hole committee that their folks are in, knowing it's gonna die. Knowing it'll never get a vote. Bills that they want go to the committees that they also control, that they know are gonna get a hearing, that'll get out of committee with a good vote, gives them a little bit more runway whenever they get into full floor. The guys will basically, a few guys are willing to sell their soul to get the power of those committee appointments so that they aren't like the other 145 out there and really don't have any power. So I've never understood that. I mean, why somebody wants to go to the trouble to get elected, the expense, the nuisance, the headaches and all of that, and then give up your power on the first day, but they're willing to do it. The only thing I can think is too many of them want the prestige of the job and not the job of the job, not the work related to the job. And so that's something we have got to start working on a little bit more. This last election cycle brought it even stronger than ever before with the way Republicans were going after Republicans. Well, if you'll remember, Ronald Reagan's one of his things, speak no evil of another Republican. You know, close doors, whatever, knock each other down or whatever, but don't do it out in public. But we got to where we were going after other Republicans on the issues that we should not have been going on. Again, we were going after them not to support their district, but to support what a party wanted. And the Democrats are the exact same way. They've done that. If I was in some of these states that they're controlled, they do the exact same thing. Just the shoes on the other foot down there. But that's a monstrosity. I mentioned Washington's farewell address. I would encourage you to read that. Very good reading. He had a good perspective, and he was scared of where we were going. And this was before you even really had political parties out there. I mean, if you look at the Russian, you got the Communist Party, the Russian, I don't know what they call it, Dalmog, or where they call it. Every place around the world you've got parties, and the parties have turned themselves into one so that they can control stuff. in our country, we've got two, okay? If two companies controlled an industry, we would call it a monopoly and we would break it up. Europe, most countries in Europe, when I was in the Senate, I got to go to Romania. They were having some issues over there, so we got to go over there to visit with them and try to teach them democracy. Their leader had just gotten drugged down the street and hung, so they were sort of in the need of some help. But they had about 14 political parties, probably too many. But whenever they formed a government, they had to work with all those folks to try to make the thing work. So no one of them could run it all. We try to run everything with a 51-49 vote. If the Democrats have 51, they're going to run. If we got 51, we're going to run it. I mean, no common ground on anything. I would encourage you to read some of Thomas Jefferson's works on the stuff. Alexander Tytler, have y'all ever heard of his quote? This was something I used at every political meeting I ever did. A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves money from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by dictatorship. And then they go through the cycle, and it goes through a lot of the countries that have done that over the years. But I think you'll realize that's where we are. The problem we've got, if you look at the budgets, I mean, when I was down there, our budget was, I don't know, $25 billion, now it's a couple $100 billion down there. It doesn't matter which party's in power. Both parties have their little special interest groups or their interest. I mean, let's be honest, they've got some things they like, and there's nothing wrong with that. So what happens when we change parties? We don't change spending, we just redirect it to these guys' favorites, back over to these guys' favorites, back over to these guys' favorites. That's one thing that Trump is trying to do, and I think that's the reason the stock market is having so much trouble right now. If you pull out the debt spending from the United States government the last 30 years, we've actually been in a recession for 30 years. If we hadn't borrowed money and debt financed, we would have had what you call a technical recession. For 30 years we've been in one. They've only kept the marble going by the debt financing. And so that is one thing that does worry me a little about what Trump's doing. I think it's got to be done, and whenever it occurred, it was going to be a problem. But you can't keep your government operating, or your economic system operating on debt financing from the government, which is what we've been doing. Yeah, and a good example, the Patriot Act. George W. Bush passed that, and we let that go through. If a Democrat had proposed the Patriot Act, I would have been up in arms trying to shoot the guy. But what happens, you'll let your guy pass something because, quote unquote, he's the one who's going to be administering it, that you would not let the other side do. Well, as we've learned, every couple of years, we're going to change parties at the top. So when we pass something that gives too much power that we think the Democrats want, they're going to get to use that power down the road at some point. And a lot of our legislation out there now is them expanding the use of the Patriot Act with Biden and Obama were in there. I mean, basically, we've got choices. We can be lazy or we can get up and learn things. I mean, you talk about committees. We need committees to try to teach people how to properly work the system. I mean, I think that's a key. At our level, we're more used to local politics, and politics is always best at the local level. Because you run into the guy on the street, if he screws up, you're going to talk to him about it. He don't want to hear that, so he's not going to screw up. How many times do you run into your state rep, state senator, or statewide office holders? You don't see them. They're down there running with their other buddies, and so it's harder to keep them in check, especially with the way campaign financing is today. They can just spend money and hide in their office somewhere. So it's hard to keep them in check by facing them down. Did I pass out school voucher thing that I did? Let y'all pass that over. The capital post is a thing that a bunch of us legislators have gotten together on over the years, and we write articles and we do things that, on different topics. And Speaker Phelan had done an article a couple months ago on the school vouchers, on the school choice issue. And so I went in and did a rebuttal to that. The problem with the school vouchers is not so much the concept of vouchers, it's how do you apply that in a state with 5.8 million students when your only bill they've got to right now is only really going to quote unquote help 90,000. And so if you've got a minority kid in a bad school district that actually wants to learn, I'm all for trying to figure out how you help that kid. Because that's, if we don't, minorities are never going to be able to pull themselves up. But 90,000 is a drop in the bucket. And what is my article, if you read through there, it basically says we have decided to give up on public schools. So we're going to do the voucher program. So those that get, a few that can bail out, great, but nothing in any of the legislation they're doing is trying to fix public schools, which we've let get away from us. Department of Education in Washington, which I listened to the new education secretary today, and she's hoping to wind that thing down. And they have got ways to try to still funnel some of that money out, but let the states and the local people spend it, which is the way it ought to be. But the state is the one that messed up most of it by taking away a lot of our controls. I mean, teachers used to be teachers. I mean, when I was in school, I got my ass whipped several times by teachers. I mean, I respected that teacher for that. And now you got just willy-nilly goes on the classroom. So they've got to bring that back.
I think they need to do a doge on the State Board of Education too.
They do. State Board of Education has gotten on out there. It's run by educators, and educators are not bad people, but sometimes they are a little lazy on some stuff and they want some easier stuff. But the old time when teachers controlled their classrooms, we were 1,000 times better off than we are.
And they can't.
And they can't. They cannot code. No, they do.
Paul,
I've got a lot of teacher clients, and they're quitting or retiring early. They're just
Paul's
tired.
retiring this year because he said, look, he said, I used to have, he said, I would have 5, 10 students that wanted to work, that would listen. He said, I might get one a year. He said, they won't hold them accountable. I can't hold them
Yeah.
accountable. They want me to teach them to weld. He said, I wouldn't give them a lighter.
Yeah, good
I mean,
point.
so he's done.
I mean, you got it, they could do it 2 or 3 different ways. You're not gonna fix the whole problem, because if you get down to it, I mean, we had a class reunion not too long ago, and the kids that came to that, I just looking through them thinking, doesn't matter if it's a black kid or a white kid or a Hispanic kid, thinking back in school, if their parents were involved in their education, they did good. They did good. I mean, it didn't matter race, it didn't matter, they did good. And so you're going to have a public school system that says, okay, if you're a parent, you want to get involved, you vote A or whatever, your kids are going to put in this set of schools. If you don't want, if you just want us to be babysitters, your kids are going in the B set, and quit trying to make equal, because they're not equal. If the parents can't be involved, you can't do it. You just don't get from A to B there. Now, one thing that on this current bill he's got out there, but basically, it's a one-shoe-fits-all in legislation, for the most part. If a state passes something, it affects everybody. But there is a concept out there called bracketing, where you can bracket bills. In other words, I can pass a bill that says, I don't want this to affect any county under 75,000, 100,000, 500,000. Texas has got little charts out there that says, if you bracket to this is who's affected and who's not. So your first thing is, if you get to looking at 99% of the people that have truly tried to object to the voucher program have been the rural guys. Because there won't be a couple Carthage. There won't be, maybe there's some schools in Nacogdoches, whether they will take them or not, it's going to be a different story. But most of these little rural counties are not going to have it. The kid is not going to be, they're not going to send a bus from, let's just say there's a great school in Marshall that we'd like some of our underprivileged black kids to go. They're not going to send a bus down here to get, we're going to get them up there. That kid already struggling, his mom's not going to be able to take him up there. So you're not going to get that kind of benefit. So then you think, well, okay, let's bracket it since it's smaller counties. They don't want to do that because it's the same problem with Robin Hood. They could have bracketed Robin Hood. They didn't because they want to be able to take the money out of the smaller rural areas that happen to have a lot of money and use that to fund their voucher program or fund their Robin Hood realignment of money program. I mean, bracketing is used a lot. But it's amazing it's not been used in any of this school stuff, because again, that tells me right off the bat, they're taking our money and giving it somewhere else. When I got elected, I was naive. I mean, from Panola County, we'd always had money. Our schools had never needed anything. But then when I started getting down in Shelbyville, St. Augustine, Newton, good Lord, those people were poor. And so, you know, the concept of us taking some of our money and giving to some of those didn't necessarily bother me that bad. But when they started taking it and then using it for the Dallas, the cities, the South Texas deal, that's where the problem was. I mean, that kind of stuff can get fixed where it could all be regionalized.
And there is no accountability for how they
No
spent.
accountability for it. You try to get down there and talk to some of those guys, I mean,
I taught in San Benito, and our principal spent like $15,000 on a pig bench for a little garden outside of the school.
man, when I was there, Teal Bivens out of Amarillo was our education chairman, and you know, we had some bills that came up, and I go, Teal, what is this doing? Here comes staff. They had carried bills. He didn't have a clue what he did. Stafford didn't really have much of a clue about what he did. A bill down there, and this is another interesting thing, there's a couple ways bills get drafted. I can sit down and write it out on paper. It ain't gonna go nowhere because it's not gonna be in the proper legal format. You generally use a place called Legislative Council. That's the people that write the bills. So your staff gets with them, goes over the concept, pulls out some other things that are sort of like that, and they draft up the bill. That's how the thing gets filed. The other big way is lobbyists. Lobbyists are generally, you know, big law firms. And what's interesting, these big law firms, they've got these 30 partners are Democrats and these 30 partners are Republicans, and they split their contributions evenly. They're not going to get called the bad side of anything because they're for everybody. They'll draft up the stuff, and so but they are real bad about drawing up legislation. And if it's not filed in certain times during the session, that's sort of a death knell too. Most of the bigger bills, the concept of them has already been pretty well drafted before session even starts. Because that way they're filed on day one. Senate Bill 1, Senate Bill 2, Senate Bill 3. There's Senate bills out there that are pre-marked. Again, this gets back. The Constitution really doesn't talk about how the Senate and the House are supposed to operate for the most part. Other than you're supposed to take up bills 1, 2, 3, order, daily order of business. Both sides, I thought that was in the first time I was down there. Oh, okay, there. First thing you vote on every morning is to suspend the Constitution. We don't want to follow that. We don't want to be following that. And that lets you take up bills outside the normal routine. So then you can take up bills 74 if you wanted to. I guess I understand the concept of it, but you know, there ought to be some priority. That again speeds up the legislation they want, slows down legislation they don't want. The voucher bill that's out there has got $1 billion for 90,000 students, supposedly, and that's $11,000. They still haven't said if it's going to be, somebody's already going to private school, or is he just now going to get an extra $9,000, and I think $2,000 for homeschoolers. When I was telling you, we looked at this topic has been up 30 years. And I went around and talked to some of the private schools, because we've got a real good private school in Tyler. There's a top-notch one over there. Longview had a pretty good one. Montgomery County had a real top-notch one. So I went and visited with some of those, and I had a lot of homeschoolers that were supporters. Nobody back then wanted it, because they knew if we give them money, a year or two later, the rules and regulations are going to follow. So all we were going to do is turn them into what they didn't like about the public schools. And in defense of that, if you're a taxpayer, what's going to happen when a school we've given $5 million to, the guy runs off to Bahamas with his secretary with the money? You know, taxpayer money went and did that, so you got to be careful. And a lot of these charter schools, you don't see much publicity on it, but a lot of them have had some pretty major financial issues going on.
Deion Sanders.
They've had some pretty interesting financial issues that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah.
You know,
And the private schools don't want special ed kids either.
Because it's expensive. It's going to cost way more than $10,000 a student to do that, no question about it. So again, you're ending up with public schools being left with harder time to deal with. And that's fine if they would let the school deal with it, but they don't. Any questions on anything? I'm just sort of hitting some highlights and.
Well, I guess the argument I've always heard the other way is competition always makes people do the right thing. Whenever you introduce competition into something, whether it's homeschool, private school, public school. When you have a monopoly of a public school, you're forced to do that.
It drives
Whether you
you
like
wild.
it or don't like it, you still have to take the money and do it. And as long as you can put some competition in there. Now, I agree, the problem I see with some of the arguments I hear on the other is, well, then once the government gives them money, now they're gonna tell them what they have to teach. And that, now you've got the same thing, just in two different camps.